أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. وما كان المؤمنون لينفروا كافة فلولا نفر من كل فرقة منهم طائفة ليتفقهوا في الدين ولينذروا قومهم إذا رجعوا إليهم لعلهم يحذرون. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected teachers, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Amongst the most famous sayings that we have common to us in the English language is, if we fail to prepare, we should prepare to fail. In reality, we have seen a shifting of the expectations of our community towards the pulpit. And that has come primarily with the democratization or the decentralization of knowledge. And as a result of that, the way in which people interact with the pulpit has been shifting over the last 3 generations. What do we mean by democratization and decentralization of the pulpit? Arguably, in our parents' generation, there was broadly a single narrative that was provided from the pulpits. When our parents were listening to majalis, especially from our community, it was primarily from the Indo-Pak subcontinent scholars, and they were listening to lectures primarily about the fada'il of Ahl al-Bayt alayhimus salam and about tabarra of the a'da of Ahl al-Bayt alayhimus salam, and of course the importance and the role of aza in one's life. Much of the discussion was rooted around aqaidi issues and the reinforcement of it, and much of it was also about ahkam shar'iyya and how to be able to deal with various masail of ibadat. If you take a step back and start thinking about the breadth of majalis that are presented today, the window has shifted to much more contemporary discussions. It is not irregular to find the pulpit speaking about matters to do with politics, or economics, international affairs, divorce, family issues, local issues. And so it is obvious to say that the pulpit, its content has shifted over the last 3 generations. The question comes, when that democratization and that decentralization of knowledge took place, when that shifting of content took place, were we consciously prepared to understand the consequences of those shifts? When we say the democratization, what we mean by that is that now everybody has a say when it comes to the matters on the pulpit. For example, we now have social media, and everyone with an account has the opportunity to put forward an opinion about any particular matter. Right now on the internet today, you might know that there is something which is known as Shia Twitter. Have you come across this term? There's, for example, Muslim Twitter, Shia Twitter, Pakistani Twitter, Khoja Twitter. Alaykum salam wa rahmatullah. What we mean by this term is that then when there's a group of people who share the same identity speaking across one platform, you can generally see the way in which those individuals are interacting with each other. Shia Twitter, meaning those people who are on the platform of Twitter and they are Shia by identity, they are speaking about a series of discussions. And you can actually search it, you can see how the conversation is developing, who leads it, where it goes in different directions. You can imagine in the month of Muharram, in Shia Twitter, there are always certain questions that come up. The issue of tatbir, for example. Every year comes up, the same arguments for, the same arguments against, the same people back and forth with each other because they don't have anything else to talk about. Or for example, in Shia Twitter, you might have quite often the discussion about Sayyid and non-Sayyid marriages. Lots of people are very fiery about this. And so for them it is the most important thing. This is always a conversation inside Shia Twitter. Today, as an example, one of the big discussions on Shia Twitter was about the affordability of ziyarah and who gets called and doesn't get called. And why is it sometimes people with all the opportunity in the world don't get to go, and those people with very little, at the last minute, they find themselves walking to Karbala. And this was the discussion today and went in many different directions. The fact of the matter is everybody has an opinion. This is the democratization of knowledge, where everybody gets a say, irrespective of whether the opinion is right or wrong. We also have the issue of the decentralization of knowledge, meaning that knowledge is no longer coming from one particular source. You can imagine that during our parents' time, there tended to be one or maybe two maraji' at-taqleed who were being followed by our community members. Normally, for example, there was one, and then when he passed away, it was inherited and another person took over. And then later on, we saw a movement where you had at one time, for example, His Eminence, Ayatollah Sayyid Abul Qasim al-Khou'i, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, and at the same time, His Eminence, Al-Imam al-Rahil, Ayatollah Sayyid Khomeini, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh. Whereas today, there are at least 30 grand maraji' al-kiram. 30 grand maraji' that you can do taqleed of, that are well known, well established, to be generally considered to be on par with each other in knowledge. 30. So our community went from 1 to 2, from 2 to 5. 5, the availability of 30. Decentralization of knowledge. And underneath them, we have literally thousands of mujtahideen putting out their ijtihadat. Be it in Beirut, be it in Najaf, be it in Qom, be it in Mashhad, be it in Karbala, and many other places. So there is a democratization and there is a decentralization of knowledge. The question we need to pose tonight when we talk about the mimbar and its direction, have we been prepared for this democratization and decentralization of the pulpit? Did we prepare properly? Because the opposite happens. When we fail to prepare, we prepare to fail. And as an outcome, we will not be able to handle the differences of opinion that are present on the pulpit in front of us today. So what I want to be able to do tonight for our series, inshallah, is for us to be able to think about how our community has grown and shifted over the last approximately 50 years. At times we can go further back, but we don't need to go too far back because otherwise it becomes so wide we lose the discussion. What have we seen in the shifts in the patterns over the last 50 years? How does the Quran and Ahadith advise us to navigate these shifts within the dynamic of a community when it comes to the entrance of new knowledge, the entrance points of new ideas? How do we actually understand how the Quran and Ahadith teach us to be able to navigate this most difficult situation? And we'll try to come out with some solutions for the challenges that we have, inshallah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Yesterday in our series, we mentioned the following important points. Number one, when it comes to knowledge, there are three groups. There is the individual seeker, the one giving the knowledge, and then the collective. All three have to have restraints on them in the way in which they navigate the acquisition and the passing of knowledge. We stated that we have a number of challenges in the community when it comes to the pulpit, not least how fractious the pulpit has become and how divisive the pulpit has become. This has real world consequences, and we gave, for example, yesterday the stats to demonstrate that there are some people that they walk out of a lecture more confused than what they were when they started, and even some that are telling us that they doubt their religion by virtue of how the scholar presents their material, because they cannot understand religion to be the way in which it is being presented, for whatever reason. We then went on to be able to think about some of the challenges that were present in the pulpit of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alih. And we mentioned two verses of the Quran, one from Surah An-Nur, chapter number 24 of the Quran, in which you found people, they would come to the majlis, but they would actually hide away from the Prophet, lest the Prophet addressed them and told them, we need you to change, we need you to act, we need you to work. They would hide behind people, hide behind palm trees. يَتَسَلَّلُونَ مِنْهُمْ إِوَضًا. They would actually snake away like this out of the majlis. This was one. The second problem at the time of the Prophet was that there were people who used to sit inside the majlis of the Prophet for the purpose of defaming what the Prophet had said. سَمَّعُونَ لِلْكَذِبِ. To listen to what the Prophet had to say in order to make a lie out of what he had said. سَمَّعُونَ لِقَوْمٍ آخَرِينَ. That they would listen for the purpose of telling it falsely to other people who had not been there. Don't for a second think that those challenges are not present today. Absolutely they are. And so these were the list of challenges that we spoke about yesterday. For tonight, we need to think about our community and how it has shifted over the last 50 odd years, and then try to find certain solutions around the democratization and the decentralization of knowledge. One of the alimas, female scholar, alima of the community, told me a very interesting story in preparation for this series of our community. And I'm speaking immediate audience to the Khoja community. One of the alimas of our community said the following. She said when she was about 25 years old, in 1981, there were 20 couples from the UK that went to visit Iran after the revolution in order to learn about the revolution itself. This was very new. You can imagine that when the revolution took place, how much our understanding of Islam shifted. I think no one is in doubt. Ask anyone of the age who remembers, was present at that time, around the world, let alone in the West, they will tell you how much Islam shifted, the way in which practices and perception shifted after 1979. People who were never wearing hijab, all of a sudden wearing hijab. People who would not come for a majlis, now coming for majlis. People who would eat haram every day would all of a sudden start to eat halal. The revolution shifted the practices of people 180 degrees. So she says we were invited 20 couples to Iran to study the revolution itself. What happened? An Iranian journalist came to us, and there was an expectation that because we're from London, we should have a great degree of knowledge. We should be very liberated, very progressive understanding of Islam, very forward. And so the question came to them, what has been your source of learning? What has been your source of learning? Was it reading books? Were you studying Hawza Ilmiya? She said, our source of learning has been solely the pulpit. And this was very perplexing to the Iranian journalist, because he had imagined it would be the opposite. That if you have Shia in London, there would be a culture of learning, a culture of seeking knowledge. For him to hear that primarily it is coming from the pulpit you're learning, he was shocked to hear this. She goes on to explain to me, these are her words to me, and I'm conveying them to you. She said she thought about that event a lot and tried to understand how the pulpit was in her time and what she truly took away from it compared to where she is today, and the shift in the dynamism of the pulpit itself. Now, this is her personal anecdotal experience, but I asked my elders to think about how much this experience matches their own. She says the following, that for example, when we were in East Africa, the program, for example, was 2 hours. Let's say on a Thursday night, right? You have Yasin, you have Dua Kumail, you have Ziyarat Warith, and you have the Majlis. So she said, for example, the Majlis was in Urdu, right? Being the primary language of Majlis at that time. So they would come on a Thursday night, and she explains, we didn't understand a word of the Quran. It's in a different language, Arabic, Yasin. We never understood a word of it. There was no translation like there is today. So we sat, we listened, we didn't understand a word. Dua Kumail, we didn't understand a word. There's no translations like there is today. We sat, we listened. Majlises were in Urdu. We heard and we listened, and maybe we grasped 30% of what was being said. So every week we went and did this. We listened, and how much did we actually take away? But we understood this to be religion. We understood that this is what the religion wanted from us, that we were supposed to turn up, listen to what we could understand about the fada'il of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, about the tabarra of the a'da of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. We listened to the gham, what we understood, we cried and we left. That was the majlis. There was nothing more to it. Now, I don't know how much that reflects your own experiences growing up 50 years ago, but let us say even partially it is true. Even then, you will also accept that by and large there were very little differences between the speakers at that time, because it was mainly fada'il and it was mainly tabarra. So you cannot have too much of a difference of opinion so long as you are praising Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. And you cannot have too much of a difference of opinion so long as you are doing tabarra of the a'da of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. It all sits within a window. Take a step back and think about the array of majalis that you hear available today. That's within one lifetime of a person. How much it shifted. From an alima of the community, saying, when we were young, we didn't understand majority of the majlis, nor do we understand what we were reciting, to the amount of the array of what is available to that same person today. This means that in the last 50 years, there has been a huge shift in the presentation, in the content and the accessibility of knowledge, which has changed the way in which we approach this particular issue, the pulpit itself. Have we been conscious of that? Have we taken stock of what that means, or how we approach that issue? Did our leaders understand what would happen when we started to introduce new streams of knowledge. When instead of having Indo-Pak Maulanas, when we start to take people from Qom and Najaf and Beirut, when we start to introduce new languages, when we start to introduce new content, were they aware of how to be able to navigate that and the shifts that would occur? Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, has the hadith in which he says, أَعْرَفُ النَّاسِ بِالزَّمَانِ لَمْ يَتَعَجَّبْ مِنْ أَحْدَاثِهِ. The person who is most aware, cognizant of the events of the time in which he lives in, will not be surprised by the events that occur in his time. If you understand what's going on, if you're able to have a picture of what is happening in front of you, you won't be overcome by those events. But if you're just going through life without an understanding of what is occurring in front of your eyes, eventually tomorrow you'll be surprised by these events, and all of a sudden the community leadership will be up in arms when a scholar comes with a new opinion. How dare he? Brother, you didn't realize that there's 1,000 hawzat out there with different curriculums? You're only realizing this now? But because we never informed the audiences of the slow shifts that are occurring in front of their eyes since 1979 to date, the community was ill prepared for those shifts that took place. And this is why now, every time that there is a debate that is raised on the pulpit, you get the same people saying, oh, he's putting doubts. You see that? The outcome is, immediately there is negativity. He's putting doubts. He's causing confusions. But we never prepared the community properly to understand difference of opinion exists. This is why difference of opinion exists. Therefore, when difference of opinion reaches you, don't be scared by it. It doesn't need to mean doubt enters into your heart in the deen, nor does it mean that you have to be left confused. We now need to show you the way to navigate differences of opinion. But if all your life, the way in which the pulpit has been is one way, when a second way is introduced, a third way is introduced, then of course it's going to cause problems for you. Fail to prepare, prepare to fail. So now what I want to do is to think about some of these shifts, the things that have entered into the community that have made this transition from a singular narrative on the pulpit to a multipolar narrative on the pulpit. One of the greatest scholars to have lived in our previous generation is by the name of Grand Ayatollah Sheikh Muhammad Muhsin Rida, famously known as Agha Burzugh Tahrani, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh. To summarize in one statement this marja's position in the history of recent Shi'ism, it suffices me to tell you that he is one of the teachers of Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Hussein al-Sistani. May Allah preserve him. If you're going to be the teacher of Sayyid al-Sistani, you've got to be worth your salt. Fair? Okay. Agha Burzugh Tahrani, one of the most famous works that he has provided to the Shia community, is a 26-volume bibliographical work called Al-Dhari'a ila Tasanif al-Shia. Basically, it is a compilation of every Shia book. He lists it and explains about it, who it's come from, authentic, whether it's available today, whether it's extant, non-extant today. He lists every type of book that's been written from the beginning of Shi'ism till today in 26 volumes. And he compiled this in 1908. So it gives you a context as to when this book, this series of volumes were written and the importance of it in the history of Shi'ism. When you go into a hadith or you go into the ilm al-rijal, you'll see that such and such a person is said to have written a book about this. He goes and talks about which books have been written in the history of Shi'ism. Now this is an important point. It's a very subtle point, but understand how quickly Shi'ism can shift and change, and whether we prepare ourselves for these issues. In it, in 26 volumes, he finds that there is not a single theological work, a single aqa'idi work, written specifically for the lay audience, the awam, by any major source of emulation, marja, since the time of Wahid Behbehani in 1791. So at that time, he wrote this in 1908. From 1791 to 1908, how many years is that? 117. Am I right? 117? In 117 years, not a single aqa'idi work was written by any marja in Shi'ism directly for the ordinary people to learn from. Now you have to ask why in your head. There were scholars at that time who were writing works on aqa'id, but primarily for scholastic audiences, and writing refutations of aqa'id that they felt were weak. For example, Sheikh Ja'far Kashif al-Ghita died 1812. He wrote a book refuting the Wahhabiyya, for example. But it wasn't for the awam. It wasn't considered a book that was directly for the awam. It was for the ulama to use in their arguments against the Wahhabiyya. Or for example, Mirza Qummi, who died in 1815, wrote a book responding to a scholar at that time by the name of Ali Mazandarani, in which he was debating the issues about Ibn Arabi and the Sufi movements at that time. Again, not for the laity. For 117 years, there wasn't a single Shi'i work in aqa'id written for the laity. Later on, Shi'ism shifted, and a number of events took place in Iraq and in Iran primarily that shifted Shi'ism. In Iraq, there was two major events that occurred. Number one, there was what was known as the crisis of the constitution, where our Maraji al-Kiram for the first time in almost 200 years stepped into politics. The reason for that was, for a period of time, after the Akhbari period, the beginning of the Usuli period, politics and Shi'ism were considered to be things that could not be with each other. Why? Because in the previous generations, the state, the Safavid state, had misused Shi'ism against Sunnis. So our Maraji of that time, from the last 200 years, said, we want Shi'ism to have nothing to do with politics. No marja is allowed to enter into politics. That changed in the early 1900s. For 200 years, we had no work on politics and policies. Then in the early 1900s in Iraq, there was a crisis with the constitution. The Maraji entered. Then there was another crisis. You may have heard of the tobacco crisis, where Ayatollah Shirazi wrote the fatwa about prohibition of working or consuming tobacco in order to push the British out of their taking of tobacco. This was the first time in Iraq in 200 years where Shi'i ulama had re-entered politics. In Iran, what was happening? Overthrow of the Shah. In Iraq, there was the push to overthrow Saddam at-Takriti. So you had a shifting in Shi'ism taking place. The thinking, the ideas were shifting, taking place. And now for 200 years, where politics had become basically haram for Shi'as to engage with, all of a sudden, it did not just become mustahab, it had almost become wajib. Anybody who knows anything about the Iranian Revolution and the way in which politics is now part and parcel of the religion will understand the shift that took place over the space of just a few decades. Now, since the revolution in Iran, we have started to see maraji' for the first time beginning to write debates on aqaid for the laity. The debates about issues in our belief system for the ordinary individual to consume. Remember, what did I say? Agha Burzuk Tahrani noted that for 117 odd years, until he died in 1908, or until he wrote the series of works, not a single work for the laity. All of a sudden, after the revolution of Iran, book after book after book after book is being produced. Now think about this. What happens to a community, a global Shia community, that for 200 years has had nothing to do with aqaid and nothing to do with politics in the realist sense, and all of a sudden these two issues are suddenly placed upon the community like that? What's going to happen to it? It's going to jolt them, isn't it? They're going to start hearing new ideas. They're going to be introduced to ayat that they had never seen before, a hadith that they'd never considered before, opinions that they'd never considered before, and all of this was going to shift the dialogue, shift the discourse in a huge way. Now, if you've understood this, that for this 200 years, there was a massive shift in the way in which things were occurring, you will actually see a very interesting ayah of the Quran that tells us about how knowledge enters into a community, and for some people it becomes problematic for them, and for others it doesn't. Open your Qurans, inshallah, to chapter number 42, verse 14. Chapter number 42, verse 14 of the Quran. This is actually mentioned a couple of times in the Quran, but I'm using this one verse for the sake of brevity to be able to show you. Knowledge, when it enters into a community, should be a good thing. But for some people, when they misuse knowledge or are ill prepared to take knowledge, it becomes a source of division for them within the community. This is very important because we're going to develop this theory in the coming nights. Knowledge in and of itself, when you gain it, shouldn't be a bad thing. But for some people, they find it to be a bad thing. It's a means of disunity. It's a means of confusion, a means of doubt. It doesn't have to be. It only is when there's ill intention or when there is ill preparation for that knowledge. Read the verse with me. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَمَا تَفَرَّقُوا إِلَّا مِن بَعْدِ مَا جَاءَهُمُ الْعِلْمُ بَغْيًا بَيْنَهُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, yet the followers of the earlier revelation, so Allah is talking about the Jews and the Christians, they broke up their unity. They used to be one group. They broke up their unity. Why? Only after knowledge had come to them, they used it out of enmity and jealousy between each other. So they had prophet. Another prophet comes to them and introduces to them a newer interpretation, a newer update of the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When they received that knowledge, it shouldn't have been problematic for them. But Allah says that when you have ilm and it's couched in baghyam baynahum, enmity between them, when it's couched in jealousy between people, that is when ilm becomes a problem. So either the problem is the niyyah, or the problem is the ill preparation of people to receive that new knowledge. And thus the way in which they decide to utilize that knowledge is actually for the negative. This has to be understood. The Quran is showing us how a community moves from being united to disunited. Specifically in the context of when ilm comes in. And that is only when ilm is couched in baghyan baynahum. Principally, having different maraji' should not be a problem for us. Only when people want to be able to misuse that knowledge, it becomes a problem for us. It should be that I can sit here and tell you, Ayatollah Khoi rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh says this in his opinion. Ayatollah Sistani says this in his opinion. Ayatollah Khomeini says this in his opinion. Ayatollah Khamenei says this in opinion. And here's how they reached the conclusion. And you can say, MashaAllah, wonderful, thank you for me acquiring this knowledge. I will utilize what is good. I will utilize where I'm in taqleed, what is useful to me. And beyond it, I don't need to take any more of it. Does it need to be a source of doubt for you? Does it need to be a source of confusion for you? No. Only when we are ill prepared to receive that knowledge, or there is baghyan baynana, if there is enmity between us in the way in which we are delivering that knowledge, that's when confusion and doubt enters in. I say, my marja has to be followed. Sayyid Khomeini said this, therefore the way in which Shi'ism is, it has to be this. You say, no, but Sayyid Al-Khou'i said this, therefore it has to be this. Now we've caused a problem where there was no problem. Do you understand? Does everybody understand? Knowledge itself should not be a source of disunity. It only becomes a means of disunity when there is baghyan baynahum, according to the Quran. Now, what we have to then understand from this point onwards is that when we had the revolution in Iran take place, we began to have the decentralization of knowledge. The Hawza Ilmiya in Najaf grew and expanded. The Hawza Ilmiya of Qum grew and expanded. After the overthrow of Saddam al-Tikriti, the Hawza of Karbala was renewed. Many Hawzat, many different spaces of learning. What people don't necessarily know, and this is so important for you to understand, is that there's no such thing as one Hawza. When someone says he's trained in Hawza, what they don't realize is that there are 1,000 different Hawzat. And what they also don't realize is that with every different Hawza, there are different curriculums as well. By and large, the curriculums shift every 100 years. The books that you are studying, the primary sources that you are studying, are going to shift every 100 years. So what someone was studying then is going to be different to what someone is studying now. There are certain books which are skeleton books that everybody studies. And then there are other books that people don't study. Moreover, there are certain books that one Hawza will consider to be haram for you to study. And in another Hawza, there are certain books that are considered to be the bedrock of the studies. Now, if you've got 10,000 students across different Hawzat, some of them studying something which one marja considers to be being prohibited from studying something which is haram, and you got another 10,000 students across the other Hawzat, something that they consider to be absolutely necessary and central, their way of understanding is going to be different. Therefore, their interpretations are going to be different. Therefore, when they sit on the pulpit, what they give to you is also going to be different. But unless you're told that, unless you understand the nuances within that, you won't be able to understand why this scholar is arguing with this scholar. It'll go over our heads. And what happens is we become the ones who end up fighting over their arguments. This scholar sits on the pulpit and says, you must believe this. Tomorrow another pulpit, no, you cannot believe this. And what happens to the people here? You end up taking his side, you end up taking that side, and you guys are arguing with each other. If only you were told the truth, that the Hawza is not one place. There are different opinions, different curricula, different methodology, different books. at least you would be empowered to understand why their ilm is actually dividing us and not uniting us. Why? بَغْيًا بَيْنَهُمْ. Because ilm was not being taken as a means of unification, ilm was being taken as a means of division. And this is what needs to change. This is something that needs to change. I'm saying it from the pulpit so that scholars hear it and that the community hears it. You don't need to get caught up in the fights of the ulama and the khutaba. You don't need to. You don't need to put yourselves in that position. Because ilm divided them, it doesn't need to be a means of baghyan bainakum, division between yourselves. Now, what I want to do is mention one last point which will allow us to wrap up for tonight about this and then continue in it tomorrow, inshallah, from the point in which we conclude. If we go to the survey, I want to show you again the issue of preparation in understanding these matters for yourself, and how the pulpits then have a certain issue when it comes to the decentralization of knowledge and knowledge coming from multipolar locations. We'll start with I think question number 16, inshallah. So as we said, we've done this survey. We've got almost 400 people that have responded to this survey, and it gives us some understanding of where we are as a community, which otherwise we may not have been able to appreciate, inshallah. Is survey number 16, question number 16 on there in front of us? Thank you very much. Okay, so what is the question? Who can read me the question? How has the decentralization of the pulpit, meaning you having access to so many more scholars, so many more opinions, affected you? Has it changed your interaction with the pulpit? Now, 208 people of almost 400 have answered this question. 6% have said the decentralization of the pulpit hasn't affected them whatsoever. 42% says, now that I have access to so much knowledge, I listen to my preferred speakers instead of listening to what comes from the pulpit. So the pulpit is available to them, but they would rather listen to their preferred speakers than come to listen to the majlis that is available to them, as an example. 40% said, I tend to now listen to a range of speakers. And this is very important. So now people have access to so much. Either they are listening to all their favorite speakers, or they are listening to a broad range of opinions. So the community has reacted to this decentralization of knowledge. The accessibility to multiple types of research, multiple types of opinion. The community has naturally acclimatized to that paradigm shift. Now what's interesting is look at the number below that. My accessibility to people has grown. My accessibility to scholars and opinions and research has grown. But only 3% said, I use it for more access to actually converse and seek clarifications. Meaning what? Access has gone up. Access to more opinions have gone up. But access to clarify matters is actually at a minimal low of just 3% of people saying. Think about this. All of these brilliant scholars, mashallah, they all have their Facebook pages, their Twitter pages, they have their Instagram pages, they have their websites, they have their YouTube pages. So access to them has gone up. But when they put forth an opinion, actually accessing them and saying, can you explain your opinion, how you arrived at that conclusion, is actually at only 3%. Can you see the problem now? This tells us the reality of what is going on the ground. We didn't realize that with all of these shifts in front of us as a community, how it would change us and the inherent problems that would come from that, the consequences that would come from this, the change in language. They're becoming many more maraji', many more different methodologies, many different speakers, many languages, many accesses. So what is the solution here? The solution has to be that we close that gap. Not that we say we listen to less people and less opinions, but that our accessibility to those opinions also increase at the same level of the access to those opinions. If I'm listening to 6 different lecturers with 6 divided opinions, as an example, I also need to have access to all 6 of them, not only access to just one of them.
Looking at that question, it was quite obvious that problem would arise, because the way social media is being used now, you access all the speakers on YouTube, and that's where it stops. There is no way to get to them to ask them specific questions. I think that was quite obvious from that.
So we said that they all have different means of access. For example, we have access to them through their pages, their Twitter pages. So if you message on Twitter, I see the message. If you message on Instagram, I see the message. If I put forward an opinion and you don't understand it or you don't like it, you do have an opportunity to clarify. You do have an opportunity to message. So I'm not quite in agreement. They have their own YouTube pages. So you can reach them and say, why did you say this? Where's your evidence for this? Their opinions are diversifying, but for some reason, accessibility is going less. But real access is there, but we're not utilizing it according to this.
I'll go one more step.
Please, go ahead.
I think that might be a generation gap here, because if you taking the questionnaires to somebody like me,
yes,
who doesn't use Twitter or to go asking questions, and I'll just listen to Majlis on YouTube and I would stop there. But the access of what you are using, I think, is still limited to a lot of people.
I completely agree. And we can go further in the analysis of this, because we can see the generation. We have one of the questions earlier on is, what's your age? So you're very right. To a younger audience who is tech savvy, you can immediately message on Twitter. But maybe for an elder, doesn't have Twitter, doesn't know of what Twitter is, they don't have access to the same scholar. So accessibility is at a relative level. So thank you very much for that point. So this is very important for us to be able to think about. When we talk about the diversification of the pulpit, we have to ask ourselves when and how that occurred and what the effects and the consequences of that was. And what we're finding is that when it comes to the younger generation, there is an expectation to know and to understand things for themselves. There is a demand to do things differently. We'll continue to talk about this tomorrow. And this is very important for us to be able to understand. Because unless we are conscious of what is happening in front of us, we will not be able to manage the shift in the dynamic of the pulpit itself. New knowledges will come in, and we won't understand how to be able to manage those different issues. Think about this for yourself. When did you, as an individual, when do you remember starting to see translation of Surah Yasin come in? Translation of Dua Kumail come in? Ask yourself this. When did you first actually understand what you were reading from Dua Kumail? And how much of an impact that made in your majlis? And the difference in which you navigated the issue of your majlis? In places like Iran, Iraq, in Lebanon, it is normal for them to have chat shows, debate chat shows, where you have ulama coming and sitting and talking with one another. You know that? It's normal. So you have a Sunni alim, a Shia alim, they come, they sit. It's normal that you might have scholars sitting and talking issues. The language of accessibility is different. For our community, my immediate audience, for the Indo-Pak community, it is a very different community. Their experiences are very different. We didn't have access to the language of things. And so immediately when new things were introduced to us, it shifted our thinking. It shifted our approach altogether. There's an ayah of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this. And this in and of itself captures the shifting of the paradigm of the entrance of new knowledge into our community. You all know these verses very well. It's from Surah Yasin. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the following: وَمَا عَلَّمْنَاهُ الشِّعْرَ وَمَا يَنْبَغِي لَهُ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا ذِكْرٌ وَقُرْآنٌ مُبِينٌ. Everybody knows it. Can anyone tell me what it means? You see, but the moment you have the English up for you, it becomes easier for you to understand, doesn't it? You know what Yasin is telling you. وَمَا عَلَّمْنَاهُ الشِّعْرَ. We did not teach the Prophet poetry. وَمَا يَنْبَغِي لَهُ. And it would not be right for us to have taught him something that is poetry. It's not right that you think that this is poetry. It would not be befitting of us to teach the Prophet this poetry. إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا ذِكْرٌ وَقُرْآنٌ مُبِينٌ. It is nothing more than a dhikr and a Qur'anun mubin, a clear recitation. This is what the Quran is. It's not poetry. It's a dhikr from Allah, a reminder. وَقُرْآنٌ مُبِينٌ. Listen to this next ayah. You all know it. لِيُنذِرَ مَنْ كَانَ حَيًّا. Translated. The Quran is to warn the one that is alive. Now, in my opinion, you can tell me if I'm wrong, for 50 years, the way in which we treated Yasin was not for those who are alive. Who did we recite Yasin for? The dead. True or not? Every Thursday night, we recite Surah Yasin. Who is it for? Marhumin. You go to the graveyard, you recite Surah Yasin for the Marhumin. Tell me, be honest. Be honest. How many times do you recite Yasin outside of, at the beginning of a majlis, or a beginning of when someone's died, or something like that? We were reciting Yasin for the dead. I'm not saying it doesn't reach them. Of course it reaches them and illuminates their grave, inshaAllah. But Yasin itself tells you it's not for the dead. It's for the alive. لِيُنذِرَ مَنْ كَانَ حَيًّا وَيُحِقَّ الْقَوْلُ عَلَى الْكَافِرِينَ. 50 years our community has been doing a particular action. The moment you actually read it in English for the first time, you realized, Yasin doesn't say just recite it for the dead. You're supposed to learn from it. It's the heart of the Quran. The entrance of new knowledge is supposed to shift the way in which you act, the way in which you understand matters. But it can only be done so when it's with clean heart. When knowledge is being introduced for the purposes of division, or baghyan bainahum, it will cause division amongst you. And this is why we end up saying it's causing doubts, it's causing confusions. What you and I need to reflect on tonight for this discussion is how we've understood the introduction of new knowledges into us, what the effects of those have been, whether we have been prepared for those, and how we can deal with that going forward. Tomorrow night lecture, inshallah, when we continue this series, will be to follow up on this. Do we empower the ordinary audience with new knowledge or not? Or do we have to just keep the pulpit as a place of reinforcement of the basics? What happens when I give you something new that challenges you? How should you react to it? Should it immediately be called divisive? Should it immediately be called contentious? Or is it a means of growth? Tonight's lecture should give you the prelude for that. When you take it as a means of growth with good niyyah, it will be so. When it is introduced to you with bad intention, it will be a source of division for you. When you and I take it with bad intention, it will be a source of division for you and I. Just think about these things for tonight, and inshallah tomorrow we will continue our series trying to think about how we can move the pulpit forward. In days like this, it is the heart of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that is breaking. In days like this, the blood of the Prophet himself is running. In days like this, the liver of the Prophet is being cut to pieces. In days like this, the very son of the Prophet himself, his heart is being torn out. His blood is running. In days like this, the very daughters and the blood of the daughters of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is running. When the captives were taken, there were those who were within the camp of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam who could not bear to depart from Karbala. Imagine seeing your father with so many wounds in his body, with so many arrows in his body. Imagine seeing your father's body headless. Imagine seeing your father's body having been trampled by the horse's hooves. Imagine what Sukayna bint al-Hussein felt like when she saw the body of her father Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. The narration says that when the Qafila were due to leave the plains of Karbala, Sukayna bint al-Hussein threw herself onto the body of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein and refused to let go. She cried her eyes out and she refused to let go of that blessed body, not wishing to be taken away from it for a moment. The narration says that because she refused to let go of that body, it was the tribesfolk around her that had to drag Sukayna bint al-Hussein off the body of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein and take her into that caravan that would eventually be paraded between city to city. The map in which the Qafila were taken is known to us. They were taken through Iraq up towards its northern borders and brought back down towards Syria. And according to some narrations, as they were taken through different towns and cities, some of which were either enemies of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, or some of which were very sympathetic towards Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. This is why you see from time to time that there are different maraqid, different stations and locations in which it is said that the children of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam were buried in these towns. Do you know why? Because when the children used to fall off the back of the camels, Zayn al-Abidin used to turn to his captors and say, "Please wait, our children have fallen off. Give us an opportunity to be able to stop so that they can catch up, or that we may go back and collect our own children." At this point, the enemies used to lash Zayn al-Abidin. He used to weep and cry, begging, and they used to lash him even more. Zainab would enter and say, "Do not lash." They used to attack and abuse Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, and they would not stop for the children that had been left behind. At times they used to enter into different cities. Sometimes the cities had Shia of Ahlul Bayt. They used to be so sympathetic. They would do what they can. They would cry when they would see the state of Sajjad, when they would see the state of Zainab alayhi salam. And then there were times in which they would come into the cities in which they were the a'da of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. When they entered into the city of Kufa, there is those narrations. When they entered into the city of Damascus, there are those narrations of the state in which they found themselves in. Imam as-Sajjad alayhi salam has a narration where he says, 6 things happened to us at the gate of Damascus that did not happen at any other time when we were paraded from city to city. Amongst the things that happened to us in Damascus was that we were made to wait outside that great gate of Damascus. We begged the captors, please place the heads at the front of the qafilah, so that when we enter, the enemies and the menfolk, they are not staring at the women and children, but they are looking at the heads on the spears. But instead they place the heads in between each and every one of the ladies. The head of Imam al-Hussein was placed between Zainab and Kulthum. The heads of Abbas and Akbar were placed between Sukaina and Fatima bint al-Hussein. Zain al-Abidin says, we entered into Damascus. They began to throw stones at us. When we entered into Damascus, they took us to that area in which they tried to sell us off as slaves, but Allah protected us from that. When we entered into Damascus, we were made to stay outside the palace of Yazid whilst they decorated it, whilst they celebrated the captors outside. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون